Facts are stubborn things. Logic is logic, and mathematics is mathematics. Once revealed, never concealed, and to do otherwise is perverse in the least, and dishonest in the worst case. Willful ignorance, I fucking hate it. It's worth noting here the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. I'm sure we all know what this is now. It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect, also becoming famous on the internet. Yay! But like those quick to point out logical fallacies, it's quite often applied wrong. Dan Ariely explained it quite well. Supposing one is employed to do a task, really boring, really mundane, dare I say even degrading. Take your pick, that's up to you. Whatever job you're imagining that is. Then imagine after a few hours of this job, the boss comes along and says, yeah, great job, here's your pay, and gives you $1 or £1. Now, how would you recommend this task to someone else? The facts are what they are, can't get shifted, they are stubborn. So what we do is shift our perception of the experience, which is subjective and within our own brain, and therefore it's not really subject to scrutiny. It's our, and I hate the fucking phrase, our truth. And we can shift it, shape it, mould it as we please. So, we might say, it wasn't a great paying job, but the value it brought to the community for me putting that effort in is worthwhile. You should definitely do it. What happens if we were paid $200 for doing the same job, £200? Yeah, it was a really boring task. I got paid at the end of it, but Jesus, I wouldn't recommend it except for getting the money. There you go. That's how quickly perception and, we can equally hold those two ideas in our head at the same time. Yeah, they are somewhat incongruous. This is cognitive dissonance. Dan went on to make comments about dating in a similar way, where we work hard to communicate with people, to build rapport. We put in a lot of efforts. We've seen the memes on the internet. Fucking hell, I'm really strong because I'm the one propping up this fucking conversation. But when the experience of this, speed dating or first interactions, whatever, turns out to be disappointing, it seems to me we can go one of two ways. We can elevate the other person in our minds to make the outcome fit with the effort that we've put in, or overgeneralise and conclude it's never worth the effort, and in extreme overgeneralisations, well, women, men, bastards, bitches, and with that kind of attitude, we're going to fit right into the MRA or pickup artist and insult communities. And because of that, we're going to propagate propaganda, because people have had a similar experience and they reach conclusions in a similar flawed way, and it becomes institutionalized, and it then gets propagated more, and then people don't even have to have that experience to realise that men are bastards and women are bitches, and then it becomes everlasting. Quite horrible, putrid, nasty stuff. It just makes the world a worse place. It reminds me of that book by Eric Byrne, Games People Play, the I'm okay, you're okay frame, but some people insist on the only way I'm okay is if you're not okay. And even if I'm not okay, if you're less okay than I am, then actually that makes me okay. So there's this kind of, I don't know what you call it. Is it relative privation? I think that's the term. As long as, if life is shit for me, as long as it's worse for everyone else, I'm okay. Point is that whatever we choose to do with facts, it gets into the realms of policy. Men are bastards, women are bitches, and we'll make decisions based on those prejudice, and therefore it becomes political. It's a policy from facts and evidence, apparently real, but this is the flaw. And it's not too hard to see how all this is entangled with identity politics, generalising the subjective experience of who we perceive and project identity, and then how we pivot that identity around the fulcrum of facts to get our policies. So if we have a fulcrum that says, someone here is wrong, on one end is me, on the other end is them, it can't be me, therefore it must be them. And, that's kind of really simplistic black and white thinking, to put rightness, wrongness as the single fulcrum, and then have some kind of unconscious projection of well, it's not me, it must be them. It's really, lacking nuance, projection, willful ignorance, whatever you want to call it. It's all there and it's horrible. But, before we get from fact to policy, there's the huge bit in between. And just to cover it off, it's been on my mind to make mention. Facts. Verifiable points of data. And how do we verify? Well, by studying and observing effects. We can tease apart phenomena into cause and effect and trace the cause of the previous effect that was the cause for the previous. We can work back the chain, or we can work forward the chain. From this series of study, we develop facts, and using the tools of mathematics, we can extract information from the set of facts available. We count, we sort, we categorize, we analyze using the tools of mathematics. We interrogate the data and derive from it the information that's embedded in the data. We discern, separate, and conclude. Let's just leave it there for the moment. I think we can see there might be issues with this. Who's discerning? How are they discerning? How are they separating? How are they concluding? They themselves subjects for investigation. So speaking of data and collecting it, it is worth pointing out that there are several recognised programs for collecting or surveying data, and the larger the sample size, certain types of errors are smoothed out. The bigger the data set, the better able we are to detect real effects. And the only way to perfectly smooth the data is to take a sample equal to the size of the entire system. And to do it, you have to do it all at the same time. This is known as a census, where everyone in a country is surveyed on one night of the year. So that's it, everyone at one particular time, there's your snapshot. And although this gives us a huge amount of data, the errors within that data set can more easily be smoothed. It's going to be as good as you're going to get, but you just can't get away from it. And sometimes it is impossible to take a census. With the application of further tools, more maths, logic, reason, we can start to build knowledge. But it's also important to note, again, that the more steps we introduce, the more layers of abstraction, the more errors we introduce. This is why test design and experimentation design to remove biases, remove faulty reasoning, and to remove prejudice and systematic errors is both time-consuming and expensive. And it's especially expensive to conduct a census. This is why typically we take samples or subsets of the whole. And of course, from time to time, it's nice to do a reference sample so that we can even peg our sample data from other experiments to the latest census, or even to a projection of census data from a few years back. So we have on the screen a little chart, 6 steps of the scientific process. And in the second box, these are not to be taken in order. You can jump in at any stage, but I'm just going to go on to the hypothesis section. I'll get on to p-values a lot later. This has really gotten away from me. But a hypothesis is a statement that is clear and concise and stated in a way that can be evaluated roughly as true or false, or actually has a kind of p-value associated with it. We'll get onto that, which approximates to a probability of being true or false. Close enough. It's actually whether to accept or reject the null hypothesis. Anyway, so that evaluation might require us to put the claim, the hypothesis, through a test, or even to design new tests to work out what it is we need to test and to devise ways of doing that. Perhaps we haven't had those ways devised yet. We might even need to make new tools and equipment. That test could be mathematical, analytical, or where that isn't possible, it might even be a simulation. It's not so cut and dried then. In physics, for example, a lot of effort is put into simulations to shape up our ideas, to help define these very hypotheses. For example, dark matter, dark energy. In these realms, physicists have noticed something, but they're not quite sure what. They don't know, so hence the nickname, and it gets a lot of ribbon in dark energy. These scientists don't know anything. You just attribute it to dark energy or dark matter. It's a magic wand. No, we don't know. The scientists know that there's something there, but they don't know the nature of it. So they're using toys like computational analytics and simulations and theoretical physics to develop ideas. From there, they can design tests to see if reality acts according to the predictions of their models or their hypothesis. And on we go. And the idea is to isolate critical factors that reveal the causal links so that we can be sure. This isn't always possible, and social science suffers from this limitation quite a lot, since it's unethical to isolate people, if not impractical, to see how they respond to a single stimulus. In science, they talk that this is expressed as manipulating an independent variable and observe a change in the dependent variables while controlling for other variables. See the Mills methods. And there may be many ways to investigate these kinds of relationships, experiments, lots of different kinds. We've got the classic controlled experiment, the little bit less robust but more practical field experiments, randomized control trials where we need to perhaps work out an average because we can't control for things. So we run the test many times and see what comes back under different settings. It's not quite so cut and dried. And we have some kind of quasi-experiments and cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, case-controlled studies, or even combinations. And a lot of new tools are actually developed through the process of undertaking something like a PhD. I recall when I did my BSc in physics, I worked on a long-term project that was started before I came to it and was continued after I left. And that was simply to refine the sensitivity of alternating field gradient magnetometers. Lots of work just to improve the sensitivity of an existing piece of kit. Each component required testing and calibration. Then, when assembled, again, the system as a whole required testing and calibration, and we're only just at the start line. So, even in the endeavour of the scientific method, sometimes you've got to stop and realise you need a new instrument, and then you've got to develop a research project to develop the new instrument. And that itself can be a huge project. I mean, like the Higgs boson took, 35 years and thousands of people and hundreds of projects to bring that about. Anyway, so we push the button now, we get data out, yay! And we're at the analysis stage. And so towards the end of this series, I don't know how long it's going to be, about 30 videos, I think. We're looking to get them out before Christmas, I think. I'll show a simple analysis on the measure of gravity as an idea of what's involved. I've got so sidetracked with a lot of other stuff. I think in my channel, I ramble on how I like. It's cathartic with all the things that are going on in the world right now. And, for posterity, 2020 sucked. And at the time of recording, I don't know how much November the 3rd, 2020 is going to suck. It gets me all nervous thinking about it. It's only a month away. So after the analysis, we get to the conclusion, which is more or less to answer the question, is our hypothesis reasonable or not? Does the experiment, the data, the analysis match sufficiently with what our hypothesis predicted? If so, the conclusion is that, as they say, all things being equal, that the hypothesis is not wrong. That's it. It's not that it's right. It's just that it's not wrong. If the data and analysis do not support the hypothesis, then time to rethink. Could be faulty equipment, could be inadequately calibrated, could be errors in reading. It could be that the hypothesis itself is flawed, or that the reasoning or maths or something's gone wrong. So something to find out, another research project. If you have good news, time to publish. Communicate to others who, in theory, will check your work, read your paper, might even corroborate some of your findings, suggest tweaks, spot mistakes, or use your conclusions as a spark of interest to investigate something else along the same lines, and on it goes. The point of doing this, and being so precise, is to remove those errors, or at least know the scope of those errors. Thus, to reduce risk and uncertainty, the predictive capability and utility of this knowledge is increased. With that done, we hopefully have insight, a working model, perhaps even 2 or 3 working models, each with predictive capability, with known limitations, known application criteria, and can then apply this insight to a design process to maximize benefits. We're in business, so to speak, to create assets that hopefully bring benefit. Now, which model we use is a function of application, context, ease of use, and known limitations. Even in the case of equivalent models with the same assumptions and same logical equivalency, we might select one or prefer another for the psychological reasons. It's easier to convey. More people in our organisation have relatable metaphors. It makes more sense in some kind of way, to immediate inspection. People are less resistant to one than the other because for some reason inherent values align, or it's in the culture of the company, that kind of thing. What about faith then? Faith in the model, faith in the facts, faith in the data is not the same faith as the faith in supreme beings described by supernatural cults or religions or mystics or whatever. Let's clear this one up as well then. So faith is a complete trust that is not based on evidence. It's a complete and stoic confidence which does not depend on evidence. It's a system of religious belief. And so what about belief? Well, belief is something we hold as most likely true, but don't know it to be true because it can't be proved. But it is a generalization about limits, about meanings, and about causes. I think we covered that off a few videos ago, and I'll probably get back to it when I come back to doing a video on risk. So in this respect, I maintain it's valid to say, I believe XYZ, but it is incorrect to state that as truth. It's why I really dislike phrases like my worldview and my truth. Sentiments seem to subvert the word truth from the truth, objectively verifiable truth, to a truth that I believe, which is my truth, which is actually a belief or an opinion, either of which can be held for any reason. The sleight of hand, the sleight of mouth, is where someone makes a claim, they also hold the burden of proof. So consider someone says it's 27 degrees outside, okay, prove it. Okay, I have a calibrated and accurate and precise thermometer, we'll get on to what those words means. Let's go outside, test, see what the thermometer says. Compare that to the bizarre claim, it's my truth that it's 30 degrees C outside, okay, prove it. I don't need to prove what my truth is what my truth is. In other words, it's a criticism shield for stupid claims. It's a bit like blasphemy laws. The meaning that this belief that the person holds is somehow sacred and never to be questioned or critically examined must be believed no matter what because it's my truth, and how dare you attack my truth. That's an attack on my identity. You're attacking me when you question my truth, ridiculous as it is. And then they have the audacity to say, well, you're obviously offended in a special snowflake. In other words, any errors will not be sought out, and therefore the belief can never be modified or corrected. It's kind of why I get bummed out when some claim science is a religion. Again, it's a misapplication of a criticism that is true when made against religious beliefs, but it does not apply to scientific beliefs. They are open to challenge, criticism and correction. It also kind of bums me out, because not being critical or open to correction is a great way of staying wrong forever. It's kind of another asymmetry that's coming to rise and more prominence on the internet at the moment, where you get this horrible far-right thing that's emerged, and they're all about absolute free speech because obviously they want to say all the horrible, nasty, bigoted, racist things they want to say. But when you criticise those views, you soon get blocked, shut down, or they resort to the old stalwart. See, these people are against free speech because they don't want me to say these things. No, we're criticising what you've said, not saying you shouldn't have said them or that you can't say them. We're criticising it and exposing it for the rabid insanity and stupidity that it is, as well as being harmful. And I'm glad to see that Reddit, YouTube, Twitch, Twitter have had a bit of a purge. 2,000 Reddit groups gone? That vile, horrible, bigoted, racist, far-right crap. It's not even... I don't... trying to decide whether it's not political rhetoric, it's just horrible hate groups, really, is what it is. Whether they actually have any political ideology, I'm not sure, but, let's try and be a little bit fair. Let's just call them hate groups, that's what they are. And, whatever, they've breached the terms of service of the platforms they're using, so fair goes. My right to free speech, the platforms are censoring. You can say that shit in your own house, in the street, wherever you like, just not on my platform. But my free speech is... Yeah, I see, PragerU got its arse kicked by trying to force the YouTube platform in court, and they lost, and lost again. I have to wonder, are PragerU so committed to free speech that they would, let a far lefty go on their channel and, spew their views? I wonder why that hasn't happened. Dear. Anyway, faith then. is the evidence of things unseen, unknown, unproven, i.e. not evidence. Just like anecdotal evidence is not evidence, it's an anecdote, and the plural of anecdote is not evidence. It's the evidence that's what gives us confidence in the things. The body of evidence is linked, correlated to the amount of confidence we should have in things. We said it, a wise man apportions his beliefs to the evidence, something like that. And we'll get on to entropy later, but this is why I mention it now, because when we talk about entropy, we're going to have a kind of nuanced discussion about what's most likely true from the available states. And if there's more available states that give rise to something, then we can say if that something has arisen, it must be because more available microstates give rise to it. Therefore, when we look at any system and take a random sample, which is why we're talking about sampling, if certain microstates are more prevalent than other states, then the likelihood is that if we look at some system purely on a random basis, what state it's going to be in, well, it's going to be the state at which there are more available microstates that give rise to that macrostate than any other state. Evidence gives us confidence. Confidence is like a probability. The more microstates there are that support it, the more evidence, the more likely we're going to be right. So what the fuck is evidence then? Another one that I see on the internet, misunderstood, especially by some behavioural economics people that I was listening to recently. One of them was talking about evident facts. I wondered what that was. I mean, sure, verifiable fact, but not evidence, not yet. So what is evidence? Evidence is a body of objectively verifiable facts that are positively indicative of one available position over any other. I'll say it again, it's all those things. Evidence is a body of objectively verifiable facts that are positively indicative of one available position over any other. Therefore, the same fact cannot be evident of two different mutually exclusive conclusions at the same time. If the same facts could be true in different or alternative hypotheses or propositions, then they are just facts. They don't become evidence until it indicates one option or eliminates another. Think about the court of law. They don't bring in evidence, they bring in exhibits, they bring in witness testimony, they bring in facts, verifiable, objectively verifiable points of data. These together build a body of evidence that paints the picture of what we supposed must have happened. There's exculpatory evidence and inculpatory evidence, in which case the evidence is said to remove or provide indication of one option over others. In other words, it gets better or it gets worse for the prosecution or the defence. As that body of evidence develops and pathways are eliminated as to whether they did it or didn't do it, whether it could be done, whether it couldn't be done, and as to how much that doubt leaves is a matter for all that legal system. I'm not really too into it, reasonable doubt and all that. Yes, the point is evidence isn't something you find, it's not something you dig up, and it's not something that is inherent in a fact. It's a body of things that are developed. So it should go without saying then that every model, no matter how good, is not free from error or defect. There are no perfect models. And a big study in science is that of error. This really is what statistics is. It's what's the difference between what the model says reality should be and what reality actually is. What's the residual phenomena left unexplained? And this is when scientists get excited because it means there's something new to learn. The model isn't quite right, or we have a fundamental misunderstanding of reality. Either way, there's something to learn. Case in point. And at the time of recording, news has made mention of the so-called black neutron star. Such black neutron stars were not thought possible. And if it's true, this will mean that the ideas for how neutron stars and black holes form will need to be rethought. Something to learn. Charlie Hoy, a PhD student from Cardiff University involved in the study, said the new discovery would transform our understanding. That's quite brave of him to say that at such an early stage. Could, might, maybe, or maybe it was the news being a bit, provocative. We can't rule out any possibilities, he told the BBC. We don't know what it is, and this is why it's so exciting, because it really does change our field. Exactly. That's how it goes. All models are defective in some way and often contain ambiguous cases. Some things are accidentally included, some things are accidentally excluded, but, you have to draw the line somewhere. What's made matters worse is that some of the laity have grabbed onto some notion that science is 100% accurate and absolute, when what they've actually latched onto is really only a shortcut convenience that working scientists use. So I just want to stop by a couple of these and to cover off a basic consideration of statistics, and then one instance of scientific shorthand that is actually meaningless but often repeated. A quick example, by the way, is fish. It's really a meaningless term nowadays. It's so broad in its description, it doesn't really have any meaning. What does it mean? Water-dwelling animal? But that includes things like octopus and stingray. So, it's a bit like the average driver, really only exists on a spreadsheet. It's not real like a fish. It's a shorthand, but there isn't really a thing as a fish. So that's kind of what I'm alluding to. So we talked a bit about stats, and the best smoothing of data in respective errors is to take a census. Expensive. Perhaps we could use a smaller set, a sample. But what kind of a sample, and how should we select the subset? Right there we encounter our first problem, selection bias. Perhaps we are lazy and we take a sample close to where we live for convenience, and perhaps we recognise this as flawed and think that if we were to drive somewhere remote that we don't know, that we can remove our bias. So we have to survey a road for traffic patterns, that's our area of study, let's say, but we didn't consult the council because we didn't want their bias, who it just so happens have closed the road for repairs. We didn't know. Obviously that's going to skew our results. Perhaps we just assumed this was a quiet road because it was quiet when we got there, and it was quiet while we counted cars, and at one end the road closed sign was just around a blind corner that we didn't notice. You might laugh. It's been done. Random sampling then. We hear about this. So let's suppose we want to get a rough idea about the length of movie shows on TV. We could sample all of them, take the average, arduous. Or we can buy something like a TV schedule guide or TV listings and select random films, hopefully not swayed by the titles or ratings of which to include in our sample. So how do we overcome that bias? Well, first we give every film title a number. Let's say we get 50 titles and we relabel them. Instead of the name of the film, we relabel them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we have a random number generator, problematic in of itself, to generate 10 numbers. Of each of the random numbers generated, we select the corresponding renamed film for inclusion in our sample set. Systematic sampling, to use the same example, is where we generate one random number and then select the film in the TV guide at that ordinal position. So for example, if the random number is 5, we start with the 5th film listed, and then we move along the list, skipping n number of titles, in this case the random number 5. And so the next film that we select would be at position 10, and the one after that at 15. And then we repeat that until we've got our required sample size. So, we start with 5, skip 5, select the next, skip 5, select the next, so on and so on. And if we get to the end of the list before our required sample, we just cycle the list starting at the position which is equal to the remainder of our sample distance. So if we happen to land on film 20 and there's only 23 in the list, we'll go 21, 22, 23, start back at the beginning, 1, 2, and that'll be our 5th one, and 7, 12, so on. Then there is stratified sampling. In this case, we would organise the films according to some category, let's say film classification, 18R, U12, PG, whatever. And then we select proportional random sampling from each category. So if we need 20 samples and the 18 category has 50% of the films, then we would sample 10 films from that category and apportion selection similarly from other categories. Cluster sampling is a method typically used in marketing research. This is where we would cut out a section of the TV guide that contains only film listings, then we cut those into smaller size portions or groups or clusters. We then would randomly select clusters to use, and perhaps then either sample all the elements of each selected cluster, or perform a second stage selection and random sample elements from the selected clusters. So you can see, not so straightforward. Now, I've said that there will be some false inclusions and some exclusions where there ought not to be. Scientists understand this and they account for it. Therefore, it is somewhat meaningless to say this group or sample is exactly this or that. It's useful insofar as we can say things like the population of humans in some regions is made of 52% female and 48% male. It's a summary statement and approximation useful for the purpose of saying that there is a disparity in male females in some region of the world which is different to other regions, and one might ask, why is that? What's going on there that's different? Something to learn. However, the approximation does miss a fraction of the population that cannot be specifically classified as male or female. There are exceptions in ambiguous cases. While the actual percentage is small, it's not an insignificant number. And this is a problem then of the layperson who takes the 52 and 48, adds them up to 100, and therefore that's evidence that there is only male or female. That no one therefore can have a classification that does not conveniently fall into these two categories. It has to be one or the other. Science says so. The actual percentages likely have a few decimal places and they might add up to 99.99. But that's the point. Rounding up is good enough for the kind of largest macro planning projects. But when it comes to specifics, accuracy and precision, the model or the conclusion or the approximation isn't appropriate to be used. I suspect as well this is why a lot of marginalised groups kind of are always at the fringes, because when you have limited resources and you want to do something for the betterment, you say, well, what's the largest group of people we can affect with this money available? Well, most people are female or male. There are these, what do they call them? XXY, XY, XX, XYYs that are not either XX or XY on the chromosomes. Now, what implications that has in terms of socioeconomic needs, I don't know. It's, again, making an example. But the point is to use these shorthand terms like fish or, 5248. It's an approximation to convey quickly a meaning. It's not to be used in a specific sense, and certainly not to be used to justify specific cases. It's either a misunderstanding or it's disingenuous. Another example is the so-called 97% match of genetic code with chimpanzees or great apes or whatever it is. I know I'm not really too up on it. While statistically not false, it's also problematic, and scientists don't really have any use for this fact. It's a useful metaphor to kind of intuitively spark interest in the non-professional. Is it sensationalism, or is it, trying to put a check on hubris? When we're not, we're special, but not that special. We're all part of the big family of life. We ought not to consider ourselves exceptional or apart from it. When we do that, we start having problems. We'll get onto the wolves in Yellowstone a bit later. But by way of illustration, consider the following sentence. The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. And now consider the sentence, the quick brown fax jumped over the lady dog. That's 2 letters changed out of 44, that's a 4.5% change. So what are we saying? These are 95.5% the same? Okay, what about where genetic sequences are repeated? The quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. So how do we account for the difference here? Is it 5 letters? It's not 5 new letters, so is it the same 5 letters repeated? So is that new information or repeated information? Or is it just one insertion? Does it count as 1 change or 5 changes or nothing new at all? How do we account for that? So this is why saying things like 97% genetic code is similar to chimps is, it's a metaphor. It has no real use. It's a shorthand. So we see this in crime statistics too. Consider a murder where the butt of a rifle used to bludgeon the victim to death. Does that count as gun crime or blunt instrument crime, or both? So, when you make claims about the percentage of deaths due to gun crime or blunt instrument trauma, you have to know whether to take those data points out of the relevant tables or to add them back in. So you have to know how those tables are constructed, what's included, what's excluded, at what time, under what conditions, and to which tables. So you have to be reasonably familiar not just with the data, but how it's been compiled. Right then. So when we quote all these stats to do with IQ, race realism, iatrogenic deaths, crime, and especially the one doing the rounds at the moment, 1350, we have to understand how the data was sampled, its errors, what was included, what was not included in those figures, and then ask the important question beyond the statistics quoting, which is the big one. That's where the understanding is. And I get the feeling that's people propping up arguments and reaching immediately for policy based off of the headline or based off a single fact, and not actually interested in having understanding or insight or developing solutions, but they're actually looking to place blame. So what is the big question? I've already mentioned it. It's what is the residual difference? In the case of 1350, where it's supposed that despite, and it always starts with despite, this is how they frame it, despite black people making up only 13% of the US population, they, and there is that word they account for 50% of the violent crime. So if we just asked on the assumption that there was no bias in violent crime for race or skin colour, what would we expect to see, all things being equal, where a cluster or category of peoples represented 13% of the population? We would expect to see that group account for 13% of the violent crime, normalised or adjusted for cluster size. Obviously, 50% is 3 times what we'd expect to see. So the burning question, why the massive disparity from expectation? And of course, it's too tempting to answer that question with your own flavour of bias. So, deep breath. What is meant by violent crime? And how is that measured? Who measures it? And how is it compiled? What's included? What's excluded? Is it by arrest or incarceration? Or is it by what's been reported? And we've already talked about false inclusion in the data sets. False arrests, setups, frames, falsely incarcerated, mistaken identity, appeals turned down, or more frequently than white folks. So the consequences of what's happening are, in 2002, black Americans were incarcerated for drug offences at 10 times the rate of white Americans. In 2020, blacks are 3.7 times as likely to be arrested for a marijuana offence as whites, despite similar usage. 97% of large population counties have racial bias in their drug offence incarcerations. Additionally, black drivers are less likely to be pulled over after sunset, when a veil of darkness masks one's race. So, what's going on? Blacks are less likely to get a plea bargain. Okay, so perhaps we've pulled the stats back a little bit towards a more accurate representation of reality, rather than reporting categories based on police and law enforcement actions and headlined propagated by newspapers that sell according to outrage and incendiary headlines, clickbait, rather than a 50-word abstract or spoiler, otherwise known as. But then, who would buy the paper if the spoiler gave it away? And when it comes to these statistics, what year of statistics are we quoting? Is those statistics different from previous years, and if so, how so? Going back far enough, you will find no recorded black violent crime. And another question is, why do people quote these stats anyway? Are they interested in finding out why the residual value is so at odds? Or are they drawing conclusions and making assertions simply on some very small subset of the statistics to leave the insinuation lingering there like a bad smell and letting you draw your own conclusion, though heavily skewed, framed in a particular way that almost leads to the inevitable conclusion? The question lingers. Why do black people commit so much violent crime? And there the job of the propagandist shill neo-Nazi shit-hack is completed. And he's done it by using the truth to tell a lie. So this is all that lying by statistics stuff. Alright, maybe he's not a neo-Nazi hack, but let's just be generous and say bigoted, racist piece of shit. This is the damage. To read such a headline and then defend it according to our preconceived beliefs does continue to disenfranchise and discriminate against a class of peoples based on race, and therefore meets the very definition of racism. So rather than follow a line of inquiry to find solutions, They let the notion of violent criminals loose on the streets, your streets, in your neighbourhood, linger and with a nod infer, yes, you could be their next victim. And like that, you're converted to their cause. Whatever dog whistles follow, inner city thugs ought to be locked up, and we all know what that means. It's the courtroom lizard theory all over again. And it effectively puts people of colour constantly on trial. If we are actually interested in finding out what's going on in this socioeconomic dynamic, there are really only two things we can investigate: environment and genetics. But as I've commented elsewhere, there is often one side of this equation that is conveniently forgotten, and it's the whole nature-nurture thing, too often expressed as nature or nurture, when actually it's nature and nurture. They feed into each other. Can't have one without the other. Can't have a genetic organism without environment. It can't exist in a vacuum. Likewise, these insights that are handed over to designers and engineers, that's great. There might be another team working on some data from which information emerges that produces knowledge that gives insight that's in conflict with the information handed over to designers and engineers. So one designs the internal combustion engine, great, much benefit. People got to travel, got to get there as quick as possible. It's been about the same amount of time that we've come to understand anthropogenic climate change. We've known about both for about 100 years, 120 maybe. But because the two have been split, we have one team focusing on nature, the environment, and another team focused on nurture. Man want to travel fast, make cars faster. All right, let's appease the environmentalists and get 25 miles a gallon rather than 18. They see each other as opposites, and I've kind of made the comment before that lies and asses are the splitting of equity, the bifurcation of the whole titles, like a trust into a beneficial title and liability or legal title. We then sell the liabilities, lies for short, to people who then think that they can split up those liabilities again into, some form of asset extracted from the liability, and the lies or the liabilities and the assets or asses are again split and sold on the open market. So again, we sell asses and lies, and so it goes on. So functional performance and development costs, obviously considerations in design, therefore, and as mentioned before, it only adds to the cost to consider the costs of the downside, as such adverse consequences to humans and the environment are often overlooked. That part of that nature-nurture is conveniently left off the balance sheet. We don't account for nurture. We don't account for the environment. We only account for the cost of building our stuff. We don't account for the cost of the damage that it's causing elsewhere. That's not our concern. So at the design and implementation stages, it all comes down to cost, benefit, profit, loss. So the commercial package skews the ideal solution and approximates it to what's affordable, what's going to benefit most people, what's going to generate the best return on investment, and over a given time horizon. And within all the other risk parameters, which increase with project size. So, I'm sure I've rambled before about the lithium and coltan mines, the impacts of hydrocarbon-based economies, the very deadly incidents like Bhopal, 3 Mile Island, not so deadly 3 Mile Island, but it shook confidence. Chernobyl definitely did have severe health impacts. The plastics that we're finding in the sea, the chemical poisoning of the water tables, the implications of lead in the fuel. Pick any disaster after disaster. Of course, the reactionary response is, so you want to end capitalism or think people shouldn't have nice things? See, it's a sentiment looking for blame at best, or that old stalwart of projecting perceived hypocrisy when they actually have no counter-argument. No, of course not. I hope we can find better ways of doing things and getting needs met without costing us everything.